anybody that has not seen the Toryumon debut show that would like to, it is on the Dragon Gate Network. If you go to the homepage, click on the Toryumon archives, it's going to be the very first upload there. I'm sure you can find it through other ways as well. This is one of those shows that has circulated very, very well, no matter what the hosting site of choice is during the era. I'm sure you can find this show elsewhere. But Mike, are you ready to dive in to the timeline of how Toryumon came to be?
I absolutely. Before we do, just for new listeners, timeline is where we try to look at the contemporaries and the other things that have come to form this. And Dragon Gate USA involved us talking about Ring of Honor and Dragon Gate and all of that going back to 2005 to present. But Case, when we start talking about the birth of the Dragon system in Toryumon, Japan, we kind of have to go all the way back, and we have to go back to 1987 and talk about the New Japan Dojo, don't we?
That's right, because so often when Toryumon is discussed, and this is, I think, largely the right frame of mind, the focus goes to the first 5 students, which we'll obviously go in depth on here in just a little bit. But, Shima, Magnum Tokyo, Dragon Kid, Don Fuji, and the man we now know as Suwa. That is the focus of this. But Ultimo Dragon is the founder of this promotion. He was the trainer for this first class. And I started thinking when we were planning this podcast about how Ultimo has now been, whether you want to say old or at times irrelevant, or at the very least past his prime, he's been in that era of his career now longer than he was an active, relevant, exciting pro wrestler. And so I think it's really important that we tell the story of Ultimo Dragon and we explain how this promotion, which, like we just talked about, has had a certain spirit and character and vibe to it for 25 years. That is all whether he was active there or not during various points in times in history. It's all because of Ultimo Dragon. And we have to explain who he is. And for those that don't know why Mike referenced the 1987 New Japan Dojo, is Yoshinari Asai, the real name of Ultimo Dragon. He grew up during the peak of Satoru Sayama and Tiger Mask specifically. He was a Tiger Mask obsessive, a stan, if you will. He was a guy who, when New Japan would run a big show on a weekend, he would travel by train to that town, and he would try to get into Tiger Mask's hotel room just to show him that he could also do Tiger Mask moves. Sayama eventually took note of him and even gave him Tiger Mask gear. And so Ultimo Dragon now, becoming an adult, 18 years old almost, he decides he wants to follow in those footsteps. He wants to become a junior heavyweight in the New Japan Pro Wrestling Dojo. He takes the entrance exam. He survives it. He's there with Chris Benoit and El Samurai and that era of student. I believe, is Muto there at that time, or is Muto just slightly before?
Muto by
87, he's there. Yeah, he's already gone through.
Yeah, he's already gone through. He might have already have done his first Muta tours at that point.
Yeah, it's right around that time.
Yeah.
But he's in there with Benoit and El Samurai and a few other names of note. So he gets through the entrance exam, and then at the very end, New Japan says, "Look, thank you for coming. Congrats on getting your ass kicked. You're still too small to be here," and they cut him loose. And at that point, that could have been the end of it. That decision right there could have changed wrestling as we know it. But instead, in 1987, he goes to Mexico. And Mike, he immediately becomes a star as Yoshinari Asai in Mexico.
Yeah, and that's one of the... I think if we're talking about hinge points of Japanese pro wrestling, the fact that he goes through all of the New Japan Dojo training and essentially passes every single physical test other than the fact that he was below 180 centimeters. That was it. And if it's something that seems like that we have hammered 180 centimeters over time, it is something that's encoded within the, I would say, the DNA of Toryumon. That the fact that this is a style in a school that has been made from being told no, essentially, and being able to go and forge your own path. And that path really immediately happens for him. Just he lands in Mexico and it takes off.
Mike, what would you say is the defining characteristic of the Dragon Gate Dojo nowadays?
I would say more so than anything
What
else.
makes them different than Noah or New Japan or All Japan? There's one specific thing that they do not require that everybody else does.
Well, they're basically, as long as you're under the age of 35, you will get a shot if your money is as good as anyone else's.
Absolutely. And on top of that, not only is your money as good as anybody else's, but there's no height limit.
Exactly, exactly. And that has been something since day one, has been such a feature here. And you mentioned the first five students of Ultimo Dragon. The tallest one is Don Fuji, and Don Fuji's at 176, I believe.
Yeah, not a ginormous man. So you have Ultimo, who starts off his career in what we now know as CMLL, but he quickly moved to UWA, who was the hottest promotion in Mexico at the time. And just by fate, Gran Hamada, in a money mark in 1990, they decide that they want to bring the stars of Universal, the UWA in Mexico. They want to bring them over to Japan and form Hamada's Universal Lucha Libre promotion. You'll see this promotion written a million different ways. Sometimes it's the ULL, sometimes it's Hamada's Universal, sometimes it's Universal, sometimes it's Universal Wrestling Federation. It's all under one cocoon, if you will, of this Gran Hamada vision of bringing Lucha Libre culture to Japan, having the biggest stars in Mexico work in Japan. It essentially, and I'm only just now realizing this, was the predecessor for the original Dragon Gate USA format.
Yeah, and it is something where you take someone like Hamada, who we've talked about Endless and other things. Sadly, when we talk about the story of Toryumon, Hamada is a factor with it, but this is kind of where we already see the two massive trunks of the Luchares tree already starting to split. Just the fact that you have this promotion that's being formed by Hamada, getting all of the stars and really the people who he wrestled with in Toreo and UWA over the 80s, and bringing them in and using that as a backbone to create his own promotion from it and start training his own students in his own sort of wrestling that he personified. And you have the person who's already along for the ride, who kind of walked the same path but did it his own different way and has his own kind of version of Luchares that comes out of it.
Yeah, so the idea for Hamada's own promotion is that Gran Hamada is going to be the drawing card, and that they're going to have this exciting youngster Yoshinari Asai. He's going to be, sort of the next man up. But they would have thought in 1990, and this promotion forms and debuts in March of 1990, that there would be a greater runway for Hamada as the star and Asai as the spry up-and-comer. But what happens immediately is that Asai overtakes him in terms of popularity and really just takes off for the promotion. I'll read this here from the Wrestling Observer newsletter, which we'll quote often here. This is September 14th, 1998. This is after Ultimo's botched elbow surgery. Dave is sort of summarizing his career. And he notes when talking about Asai and Universal, he says, and I quote, "Hardcore wrestling fans in Tokyo and Nagoya made Asai, with his graceful style, hard work, and unique flying moves, such as his trademark Asai moonsault, into the big star of the group, throwing money at him after his performances. In a sense, Asai and Universal changed Japanese wrestling because he was the first wrestler who was basically a middleweight who became the top star of his company. Because of his Japanese success, he was quickly given the UWA Middleweight Championship to signify to the Japanese fans that he was indeed a superstar in Mexico for his status when he would make return tours, and they gave him a title belt to defend as a result, which he wound up holding a record of 5 times," end quote. And this is really important to note because, again, Ultimo's so funny because depending on when you catch him, you have a very different idea of who he is. Most people are going to, treat 1996 through 1998 as the Ultimo Dragon time period. It's when he's in WCW. It's when he's in New Japan. It's him doing his highest profile stuff. Me personally, I'm familiar. I'm watching in real time post Prime Ultimo, so I don't always have the most love for him. But the era that gets overlooked the most is before he was Ultimo Dragon, when he was, a borderline, karate gimmick, unmasked, real name, and he comes into Universal, and specifically his feud with Negro Casas, which you can find one of their singles matches on YouTube, and I would highly recommend checking it out. By the end of 1990, he is one of the best wrestlers in the entire world.
And it's something that pretty much, and one of the fun things about Hamada's Universal is it's not a very hard promotion to track down, I feel like. And it's not sadly, did not last super long. Basically, by the end of 93, it is done. But you really see very quickly that Asai is this first of like the next generation of junior heavyweight stars. And it's especially I think it's notorious in a way because he's doing it completely out of the All Japan, New Japan paradigm. He's doing this in this promotion that essentially was an indie promotion, becoming this just hinge point star that was really built on this. And in a way, it's before the timeline kind of lines up that he's starting to do these things before he's really uh hitting his prime in a way. Because for me, okay, so like if we talk about Ultimo Primes really quickly, for me it is that what comes right after Universal for me.
Interesting. So that's a great point on a few different levels. One, you're exactly right. Universal stuff is easier to find than people realize. There is some weird perception, because I've read this a few different times, that there's not a lot of Grand Hamada footage out there, or that there's not a lot of Universal footage out there. And that is not true. There's quite a bit of it on YouTube, but if you're familiar and you know how to look through archive.org, I mean, there's not only the television broadcast of Universal, but they have a boatload of handhelds on there too. There's actually a ton of this promotion out there. And yeah, it's a beautiful thing about Ultimo's career, where I think throughout the 1990s, whether it's a year or a phase or a promotion, a lot of different people can side with different points in Ultimo Dragon's career. And being a legitimate superstar on the independent level, that starts to create friction, because Universal is founded in 1990. By 1991, the vision that was there is just not what it was. The promotion is starting to have financial problems, and that coincides with financial problems in Mexico for the UWA as well. So in November of 1991, CMLL, they coaxed Dragon Gate away, or not Dragon Gate, but Ultimo Dragon away from the UWA, away from Hamada in Japan, and Ultimo all of a sudden is given, or I guess I should say Asai, is given the Ultimo Dragon character. He was supposed to debut on October 28th, 1991 in Arena, Mexico, but UWA had, this is Dave's words, one more trick up their sleeve, as Asai's working visa was with the UWA and not CMLL, and word got out that they were going to give him immigration problems if he worked that CMLL show. So Dragon would go on to work the show by doing a run-in and seemingly skirting any immigration issues in the process. And as Dave later put, the temporary headache would be worth it, as for the now masked wrestler, Asai was getting paid nearly 9 times as much money as he earned in the UWA. And according to one source with his new deal, Asai became the highest paid Japanese wrestler ever to work foreign soil, as his contract was better than Keiji Muto's while he was the great Muta in WCW.
And to be clear, I think this quote basically is up until like 1996.
Yes.
Like it would be Muto coming back that he would finally get paid more than what Asai was getting paid.
And I think, this is where, if you want to look at the man Ultimo Dragon, which this podcast certainly has, this man loves his cigars, he loves Cuba, he loves fine living.
As of this time of recording, Case, how much does he love fine living? He skipped out on a Dragon Gate show to do a boat cruise show.
Yes, that is exactly right. I don't know if I would call that fine living, but nevertheless, he's on a boat right now.
He is on a boat right now in the Caribbean, which for him is fine living.
But, I started to think about this because there's the Taylor Swift quote where she talks about how you are sort of stuck frozen at the age you're at when you become famous. And Ultimo, as we can now permanently refer to him as, he is a big star in the UWA when they are the top promotion in Mexico. He then bounces to CMLL and becomes a big star there briefly before the AAA split. He becomes one of the most infamous juniors in New Japan Pro Wrestling's glory period of the junior heavyweights. He becomes, other than Rey Mysterio, the most recognizable cruiserweight in the WCW division. He then gets back with CMLL when they take control of the top spot in Mexico in the late 90s as well. Up until his arm injury, he is a star in the hottest promotions of whatever country he's working in. And he was a legitimate star in 3 different countries during what can be looked at as a peak era. And so while we could roll our eyes at Ultimo not bumping in indie matches and not bumping in Dragon Gate matches, and, you know, in Dragon Gate at times, not often, but at times having a shocking amount of pull and getting his way, there is a little bit of him where I can understand him going like, look, I'm Ultimo fucking Dragon. Like, I've kind of done this a time or two. Just listen to what I say, okay?
Yeah, and if there's one thing I hope that people take out of this timeline, I think it is that his Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame position is unfairly maligned by people who don't realize how much of a draw he was in those territories at that time. Like, yes, was he ever the top person in WCW? No, but if you would list people that people remember from that era of WCW, you're not going to get too far talking cruiserweights before you bring up Ultimo Dragon. And then you extend that back to, he was never full-time with New Japan. Like, he never, after they kicked him out, like, I don't think he ever signed like a full-time contract with New Japan. He was doing that as an independent.
And he was doing New Japan as a draw, as a special attraction,
while he was also doing WAR, which was his actual contracted promotion.
Yeah, exactly. So Ultimo is now in Mexico with CMLL, but because he leaves UWA in Mexico, he has to leave Hamada's group in Japan. So he links on with SWS, another rich man that wanted to start a wrestling company.
And just to jump in here, Case, SWS, as we go through this, and if we make this into like an ongoing kind of thing, Case, I will constantly hammer home SWS is the progenitor of basically modern indie Japanese wrestling, because if you follow the splits from SWS, you get Dragon Gate and you get DDT.
What a gift.
Yeah,
you know, I look
it's
here.
Wild.
I was thinking SWS was worthless. Turns out, no, it's not.
Hey, Pro Wrestling Crusaders and WAR. Pro Wrestling Crusaders, which would later down the continuity end up being DDT, and then WAR, I would probably call like the more spiritual predecessor of Toryumon, basically.
SWS is really the MLW of its day, where like I'll be going through YouTube sometimes, and I'm like, oh, Tenru versus so-and-so from SWS. This sounds good. Let me check this out. And it's always at least a half star worse than it should be. Like if it was a New Japan match, or if it was an American promotion other than MLW, you finish the match and you go, well, that should have been better. Why is MLW where good matches go to die? And it's the same exact vibe when you watch old SWS.
Yeah, and it is something that, as we get into talking about people who ended up kind of weirdly influencing these people, I mean, you could do a line that the reason why a lot of people ended up in WAR, who later would end up in Dragon Gate and Toryumon and then Dragon Gate, would be because of the figure that was SWS was based around, Genichiro Tenryu.
Yes, exactly. So, you know, SWS turns into WAR. I don't know about you. I associate Ultimo most with, in terms of Japanese promotions that he worked, I associate him with WAR. It's just
absolutely.
I mean, you know, their top star is obviously Tenru, but in terms of a full-time guy that they had, I mean, he's at the very least got to be up there, right, in terms of star power?
I would say so, and I would say that also when you talk about featured matches of that time, and this is one of the wild things is this is about the start of the internet, or at least the consumer internet. So you can, if you search in the right places, you can find people talking about it in real time. They're not talking about Tenryu. They're not talking about all the various people that kind of go through. They're talking about Ultimo's matches, and especially like Ultimo and Jericho and Sumo Hall, things like that.
Well, Ultimo, Jericho, and Sumo Hall, Ultimo and Ray, and the J Cup 95.
Yeah, it's never about Tenryu or Tenryu's really his true spiritual heirs. It's about Ultimo.
Absolutely. So The mid 90s, which is what he's most known for, I'm going to gloss over this just a little bit. In 96, he starts working WCW, cruiserweight champion there. He becomes the J Crown winner. That's the famous photo everybody knows where Ultimo's got. He wins the 8 belts from the J Crown, and then he's still got 2 left over. So he has 10 belts by the end of 1996. At that point, it's New Japan, it's Mexico, it's WCW. He's working all over the globe, and he's a big star. And Mike Spears, at the beginning of 1997, Ultimo Dragon decides that he is going to start training the next generation of stars. Anybody that wants to come with him to Mexico, no size requirements. They just have to pay to get to Mexico, and they can train with Ultimo Dragon. And on May 11th, 1997, we have the very first Toryumon Mexico show. Is now the time to talk about the first class of Toryumon students.
Yes, and it is now time to talk about these 5 guys. Kind of, I would say that we have you could put some of them in multiple camps. Like, I feel like in a way, Shima and Dragon Kid are 2 very kind of, I wouldn't say similar kind of backgrounds, but they do kind of come from one way, and Magnum Tokyo and Don Fuji end up coming from a much more different way, and then you kind of end up with Suwa, who is kind of like this X factor of this class, I feel like.
Well, Suwa's an X factor in wrestling. The guy never fit in, and it was his charm. But as we go through the backstories here, let's start with Shima, right? So, in the same way that Ultimo Dragon idolized Tiger Mask, Shima idolized Ultimo Dragon. He was a JWA Kansai wrestler, which, Mike, this is your wheelhouse. Can you explain to the folks at home what JWA Kansai was?
So, it's something where the closest thing to kind of call this is, and it's very unfair, is backyard in a way, but it's not it is something where it's amateur, not always traditionally trained wrestlers, and a lot of people come from this style of amateur. It's usually called amateur pro wrestling, and if it's either from promotions like JWA Kansai, which was based around Osaka, Shima had multiple characters, but most known as the Masked Man, Flying Mickey Hayano Jr. and also Mickey Hayabusa Jr. He's had a couple of those characters, but other people who've gone through JWA Kansai are Masato Yoshino. But when you talk about amateur wrestling, this is a generation that was the first one to kind of go from this amateur style and like non-traditional kind of wrestling with friends and like putting on our shows that way into actual pro wrestling, because the current president of New Japan Pro Wrestling is an amateur wrestler because he did it in college, like college club wrestling. So you have that for Shima, and it's something where he did this and he kind of came up this way because he came from a very kind of impoverished blue collar upbringing, like to the extent that he was the youngest person in these classes. That he was, I don't know like what his final like level of education is, but it is something where he left school early to work and to save up money so he can go to Toryumon, basically.
Absolutely. And then, similar kinship is Dragon Kid, who I think a lot of people know his story, wanted to be an FMW wrestler, and FMW told him no. He found out that Ultimo Dragon was opening a school, and so to help pay for his entrance fee into Toryumon, he started doing all of the hazardous FMW matches. There's a few where you can see an unmasked Dragon Kid and, exploding barbed wire, cage matches, etc. And then he ended up being recommended to Ultimo Dragon through Jinsei Shinzaki.
Yeah, and he kind of is the first of a lot of former FMW guys that end up in the promotion. It's kind of funny. Like, you would either say, like, from like the first, I would say 3 or 4 classes case, you guess, are they a WAR guy or are they an FMW guy? Dragon Kid holds up that end of that. And let's just talk about the WAR guys. First and foremost, kind of the one that it ends up being like the most identified with it because his relationship with Junichiro Tenryu was so strong. Magnum Tokyo case. Do you want me to run down his backstory?
Yeah, please.
So, in contrast of Shima and Dragon Kid, who had a lot more working class backgrounds, Magnum was a rich kid, essentially. He was a salaryman working for his dad's company until he saw Ultimo working in WAR. He wanted to become a pro wrestler. He always kind of wanted to do this, but he had to go work for his family. He was able to basically say, like, hey, Tenryu, I will be essentially your bag boy for this because I want to be a pro wrestler. Tenryu never really thought that he was going to do this until Ultimo started doing Toryumon. It's like, yeah, go do that then. So that he came up from WAR, and it's something like even like after Magnum left Dragon Gate, there was always kind of the Tenryu factor with him.
Yeah, I mean, well, when Magnum leaves Dragon Gate, they had just formed the Renaissance unit, which was what him and Fuji and Mochi and
Konda.
Konda. Yeah, Konda's the fourth one, and they're doing. I mean, Tenru, the last promotion that he worked in, other than his own, on a semi-regular basis was Dragon Gate in 2006, and so all of those guys are either teaming with or wrestling against Tenru, and that was eight years after Magnum had left or 9 years rather after Magnum had left for Mexico. But that goes to show you that the WAR bonds are strong. As also Don Fuji, who was a sumo wrestler in his younger days. He joined WAR and then moved to Ultimo School. He was part-time in the WAR dojo, but was doing business stuff for them behind the scenes. That's what kept him around. But he never debuted for the promotion.
Yeah, so the interesting thing, and I was able to find this today. So Don Fuji, legitimate sumo wrestler, he made it only to the fourth highest rank, Sandan Mei, which is basically, you're essentially still an amateur case with this. You aren't salaried. You get basically you get an allowance. You are not a young boy, but you are just essentially one step above it. And Don Fuji said that he was going to give sumo 10 years, and he gave it essentially 10 years. Never made it really pro, just kind of stayed in. Essentially, was a career-long minor leaguer, and then by his mid-20s, he decided to move on. And Tenryu, again, former sumo wrestler himself, there was a natural kind of end with that. So that's where he ended up there.
I've said this many times on VoiceGate throughout the years, but had Don Fuji actually wrestled for WAR, if he was 10 years younger or was born 10 years earlier, let's say, and he's an indie Japanese wrestler in the 90s, he would be considered to be a sneaky all-time great that the PWOs and Segunda Kaitas of the world would worship. They would build him a monument. They would pray at his feet. He would be considered that level of good. He just happened to work in Dragon Gate, and so 25 years of goodness is often overlooked.
Yeah, and it's like wild. He really does have that energy of would be teaming with Koji Kanemoto at a Tenryu Project show today.
Yeah, very much so. So the other member of this original class is Suwa. He was an Animal Hamaguchi trainee, so think Milano Collection AT, think Shingo Takagi. I don't know how he got hooked up with Animal Hamaguchi. I would like to get a little bit more information on that. But Suwa also shows up in Mexico with these guys. And other than Dragon Kid, they all debut on the May 11th, 1997 show. Not Ultimo, but Dragon Kid would debut on a CMLL show that year at Arena Mexico. I think it was November 14th. He has his debut. It's those five. So Dragon Kid, Shima, Fuji, Suwa, and Magnum. Plus the man we now know as Super Shisa, but all caps Saito. And a quick note on him. He was a Michinoku Pro trainee who didn't make it through the Michinoku Pro system. He also trained in Mexico with Ray Mendoza. And I'm a little confused on the timeline because Shisa has tweeted in the past that he trained in Mexico with Hayabusa when he left Japan very briefly and then came back and basically became a big star. I'm very unclear on the timeline of a lot of that stuff, but I know he credits Mendoza as his trainer, and I know he spent time in Mexico in 94-ish with Hayabusa.
Yeah, my impression always was that Saito was one of those guys who kind of after Hamada ended up working in Mexico or training in Mexico because they were too small for the traditional dojos, or they did not want to do Animal Hamaguchi's kind of prep stuff. They wanted to do actual training. So it was something where, like, I have no idea how long he was in Mexico. I just know that he was in Mexico, trained with Raymond Mendoza, and by the time that Ultimo was running stuff in Nalcapan with Dos Caras, he ended up joining them in the dojo there.
Yeah, so he's a little bit like Tsubasa, who is a guy who Ultimo actually trained before Toryumon, but just a Japanese guy who really loved Lucha Libre.
Right, yeah, and I think that it's something where in a lot of ways, Saito Shisa, and he kind of becomes who he is, like, in contrast to Ultimo, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, very much so, very much so. So that is the first class of Toryumon. Those guys all, like I said, they debut on May 11th, 1997. We'll get into what they did leading up to that debut in just a second. But Mike, can we talk about the second and third classes real quick because these guys are also on the debut show?
Yeah, that's right. These guys are really considered the backbone of Toryumon Japan, and they are second and third term students. Really, they're lumped in as second class, even though the last person technically was in third class, but he made it into Japan earlier. It is Kenichiro Arai, a former FMW student, Ginki Horiguchi, longtime SWS fan, Yazushi Kanda. Big fanboy of Tiger Mask, Stalker Ichikawa, and Susumu Mochizuki.
Real quick on Horiguchi. So, for those that don't know, last year I wrote a 20th anniversary column about his El Numero Uno 2003 performance, which picture Genki Horiguchi in your head. That man was essentially born during that tournament that night, April 22nd, 2003. I interviewed Horiguchi for the piece, and I heavily lifted from a sit down interview that he did with Pure Riso today on their YouTube channel in 2021. And so I go really in depth into the story of how Horiguchi chose to become a wrestler because he was somebody who was very undersized, very much not your traditional build. He, oddly enough, and this is where SWS becomes useful again, went to an SWS show in his hometown, blew his mind. He thought he wanted to be a baseball player, went to that show and said, nope, I'm going to be a pro wrestler. He tried to get linked up with Yoshiaki Yatsu's essentially backyard promotion, the Social Pro Wrestling Federation, and didn't make it into their dojo, which his mother laughed at him when she got the phone call that he did not make it. And right when he thought that he was going to give up, he found out that Ultimo Dragon was looking for students in Mexico, and he went down there. So, again, a lot of insight from Horiguchi specifically into the start of his career, his time in Mexico, and how he got there. That's all at voicesofwrestling.com on the article titled Hage, the Enduring Legacy of Genki Horiguchi and the Backslide from Heaven.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I feel like with this class, you have guys that really, I would say, were born of that early '90s early to mid '90s indie scene, especially with like Kenichiro Arai and Horiguchi in that manner.
Yeah, no, it's a natural evolution of what they had seen, especially whether it be FMW or WAR or Michinoku Pro, which we'll talk about here in just a second. I'm going to go to the Observer as we need to talk about the impact that Toryumon had in WCW. And shame on me for not trying to reach out to fellow Voices of Wrestling Discord member John Muse to get his insight on this because this is something that he could really speak to. But it really dawned on me today as I was looking at some match records just how often Ultimo Dragon students, the first term students, were used in WCW all throughout 1998. They're there from February through November, basically.
Yeah, and it's something where maybe it is that you think about, as they called them there, Tokyo Magnum and Dancing Fools, and Ernest the Cat Miller going after Shima Nobunaga. But it was something where, like, their bread and butter ended up being the Saturday night and the WCW Pro shows, where never really in any sort of programs outside of the Dancing Fools and the Ernest Cat Miller Nobunaga thing. But essentially, it was something where you had Ultimo already always having these kids around, essentially. And when I say kids, Shima is 21 at this point, which is just mind blowing. But it's something where when we always talk about how Fusient and Eric Bischoff wanted to base WCW around Toryumon and the Cruiserweights, and MLW wanting to have the Cruiserweights in the early 2000s. Like, a lot of that is based on the fact that Ultimo was the guy who had his students front and center in front of, at least in 1998, the biggest promotion in the world at that time. And
Yeah.
it already kind of got them in a way that there was a leg up that was not there for a lot of the other I would say wrestling Japanese independent scene up until the mid to late 2000s.
Well, you think about it. I mean, they're working IWRG in Mexico. They're working Michinoku Pro, at least the Crazy Max guys are in Japan, which we'll talk about their time in Michinoku Pro here in just a second. And then they're working WCW. And I want to read from the April 13th, 1998 Wrestling Observer newsletter. Dave is referencing the El Dandy La Parka and Psychosis versus Judo Suwa, Shima Nobunaga, and Tokyo Magnum match from the April 6th, 1998 Monday Night Nitro. When he says the Japanese are 3 students of Ultimo Dragon School in Nacampon, Mexico, and considering their experience level, look great. Magnum showed a ton of personality and potential. Best match on the show. End quote. And reoccurring theme on this episode: the personality and potential of Magnum Tokyo.
Yeah. This for those who are wondering about when we were going to get real sicko about Magnum Tokyo, this is it for this is like his prime right here, and it was very easy. Like when you think about the characters, and I would say that other than the Crazy Max evolutions that just would not have an opportunity to happen in WCW because why would they? He is the one that like when you would pick out of the 5 guys, you would pick Magnum and you would pick Dragon Kid or Little Dragon at that time. Like those are the 2 that like jump off the screen for you. And the fact that WCW very quickly, and maybe what would have happened in the world of the Dragon system if they didn't decide, hey, we like the Japanese stripper guy. I wonder like that would have happened at least. Like would cooler heads prevailed in 2006, basically.
Yeah, I mean it's so obvious in the landscape of WCW that it's Magnum is just he's on a different level. I mean, again, they don't really get behind him in a real way, but it's a different ball game when he's on the screen compared to Suwa or Fuji or even Shima. The other guy, like you mentioned, is Dragon Kid, and Dave says in the July 6, 98 Observer, he says, Little Dragon pinned Eddie Guerrero in 423. Dragon is a protege of Ultimo Dragon who has amazing agility but is still green since he's been wrestling a year, but will probably be another Rey Mysterio Jr. in about 3 years.
Dave was overestimating it by about a year and a half.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking, I would say mid 2000 is when, I mean, that's when he figures it out. So that's a little bit of their time in WCW. We'll get back to that. But something big happens in July of 1998. Crazy Max, Shima, Fuji, Suwa. Before I even say what's next, I guess we have to explain Crazy Max. I don't know if everybody fully knows what they are, but for the entire existence of Toryumon, they all together are the faces of the promotion, even though they started off as heels.
And it is something where even in 1998, so when we talk about them going to Michinoku Pro, this is also the time where we kind of need to talk just a second on the status of Michinoku Pro in 1998, because this was something where Sasuke, another former Hamada Universal wrestler, is kind of left in a little bit of a lurch because of his big draws in Kaientai Deluxe, by and large, with the exception of Kaz Hayashi, all signed with WWF as they form the light heavyweight division. Allegedly, Sasuke talks his way out of winning that championship. It goes to Taka Michinoku. Kaientai basically gets controlled and paced into WWF, and they leave Michinoku Pro. Michinoku Pro in 1995, especially, like up until the departure of Kaientai Deluxe, is the other side of the Japanese indies that's inhabited by FNW and WAR. And essentially, at this time, the way that Michinoku Pro exists is a home army versus a heel invading force. And what do they have to do, Case? They have to go take their biggest star and turn him heel. And Sasuke turns heel, forms Sasuke Gumi, and he needs to have new guys backing him. And he brings in Crazy Max as the new heels that the Michinoku Pro Sekigun Babyface Army have to vanquish to defend the rights to Hoku.
Yeah, when we talk about the Dragon system lineage, it's very easy to follow. It starts with Hamada and everything that he does in Mexico, and really we can bold with a highlighter his promotion, Hamada's Universal in Japan. Ultimo leaves, does his own thing, trailblazes, forms a relationship with the WAR guys. Sasuke leaves in 1993 because they're out of money in Universal. He becomes the first promoter not to base his promotion out of Tokyo, Michinoku Pro Northeastern Wrestling, and takes the Universal trainees, takes all these guys that Hamada has trained, gives them flashy gimmicks, he essentially creates his own army of Japanese luchadors. And then, I think we all know the story of the Sekigun versus Kaientai DX. The thing that I pointed out when I wrote about Masaki Mochizuki for his 30th anniversary over at voicesofwrestling.com, Michinoku Pro struggled to ever evolve from Kaientai DX versus the Sekigun Army. Even the Crazy Max stuff, by that point, they were over the hill. It didn't make a ginormous difference in the box office.
That's essentially what Michinoku Pro has done to date. Like, they always have a heel army going up against Sekigun. They've never gone past that.
Yes, exactly. Whereas, and the reason I bring Mochizuki into this is the first year of Toryumon is Crazy Max versus the Toryumon Sekigun. And the only reason that this promotion has a legitimate lifespan, that they're able to progress past hot indie with some buzz, is that M2K is formed. Susumu Mochizuki, Masaki Mochizuki, Yasushi Kanda. They turn Crazy Max babyface. They become the heels of the promotion. And all of a sudden, life is pumped into Toryumon in a way that they've never given up those breaths ever since. But Michinoku Pro never had that. And at a time of desperation, they call in Crazy Max. And this is where I always have a bit of a hot take, but my two favorite eras of Shima's career are, one, 2018, after he left Dragon Gate, the 6 months where Wrestle 1 was really hot and he was in DDT and he was going to go to AAA and he was bouncing all around the world. And two is Michinoku Pro in 1998. I think this is some of the very best work of Shima's career.
Yeah, and it's something where Kaientai Deluxe, like, it would end up being like beatdowns, and it would be in a certain kind of way that is not dissimilar to how things would go. Crazy Max escalated things. They would break down the rig, that they would grab the ringside bell and start ringing it themselves to kind of do this. They would have the big thing was that Sasuke had a special card table, chair and table that he would sit at and smoke cigarettes, as Crazy Max would just like destroy things. And it was just its own kind of aura, and it was all led by, at the time, Shiba Nobunaga's just unparalleled charisma. And it worked in a way that Magnum, when we talk about his charisma, he found it where Magnum found himself, however, like embodying the Magnum Tokyo character. He just kind of sunk in there, and he always kind of has been that. Shima kind of finds himself, I think he takes the lessons he learned in Mexico and he applies it in Michinoku Pro, being this pure, just creative Rudo. And it is something that we get to see a little bit of it in 2010, I would say, Case. Like the very early days of Blood Warriors, I feel like we kind of got a little bit of that, but he's never kind of gone back to that style ever since.
Well, okay, yes, you're exactly right. I mean, in the same way that Magnum just popped off the screen to an irreverent degree in WCW, where you could watch those Nitros and go, oh, he's the star of this group. Shima does the same thing in Michinoku Pro. He works like a rabid dog. I mean, it is
again, dive bombing, and it like he just like tears things apart.
He's what, 21 when he's in Michinoku Pro? He was born in 97 or 77. So yeah, so he's 21 years old, 20 for the most part when he comes into Michinoku Pro, and he works with such a charisma and such a confidence and such polish, which is the important thing, because Dragon Kid had a lot of charisma, but Dragon Kid lacked polish the first year and a half of his career. Shima just comes in and immediately becomes the focal point of this promotion. I can't recommend the Crazy Max stuff in Michinoku Pro enough. If you're looking for a specific match, one that I know is out there, Suwa, Shima, and Fuji versus Masaru Seno, Masato Yakishuji, who is one of your guys, and Solar. That is from the January 8th, 1999 show. That was televised. That is out there. Go find that match. A real late era Michinoku Pro gem. But this is where Crazy Max, as we know it, they work together in Mexico, but Michinoku Pro is where this unit starts, and it becomes, again, the defining factor of Toryumon. They're there through the entire promotion. They fold in October of 2004 once the promotion has turned into Dragon Gate already. So you can't overestimate or understate rather the importance of Crazy Max to Toryumon, to the Ultimo Dragon gym, because it's a three-headed dragon of superstardom. And in Michinoku Pro, again, I mean, think about post Kaintai Michinoku Pro. Like, I can't even think of early 98 Michinoku Pro. I don't know what they're doing. It feels totally irrelevant.
I think we see what happened in 1999 happening a year earlier.
Yeah, exactly. The Crazy Max gave them life, and it was through Shima again, just wrestling like a madman. I mean, it's a bummer that we didn't get more of this, because even in Toryumon, he feels too established. It's almost like he got too big too fast to really do what he was doing. Whereas at Michinoku Pro, it's his first real matches in Japan, and he just comes in like the world owes him something. It's just remarkable to see. So Dave notes in the August 10th Observer from 1998, Crazy Max debuted in July, and they must have done so well that Michinoku Pro invites them back after their first tour. And then we have this very important note, September 28th, 1998, Wrestling Observer newsletter. Dave says, and I quote, Ultimo Dragon held a press conference on September 17th, saying, among other things, that he was planning on suing the WCW doctor who performed his elbow operation. He mainly announced that he would be forming yet another new promotion in Japan called Toryumon, which would debut on January 31st in Cork and Hall for a one-week tour. He said he plans on promoting four 1-week-long tours in 1999 using his students like Magnum Tokyo, Shima Nobunaga, Sumo Fuji, Judo Suwa, and Dragon Kid, and hoped he'd be able to return to the ring in time for the first tour. End quote.
Yeah, so I forget which day or when the elbow operation happens as it relates to the timeline of the birth of UDG and Toryumon, but it is something very much where the overall idea around this was that he would bring his students every quarter. They would do this tour, and they would all go back to Mexico, and the ones that would have already graduated up and get through it, they would have the work in Michinoku Pro, but it was all still really based around those 4 1-week tours that Ultimo was going to headline.
Yeah, if you're somebody who is ever curious about watching Toryumon from the start, and you can do that because the Dragon Gate Network has essentially every Toryumon upload up through the end of 2003. I think they're missing one TV from December of 2003, and then they just have 2004 left. But all of this stuff is on the Dragon Gate Network, at least 1999 through 2003. In the first year is really simple to watch. It's not complex at all. It's, some of Ultimo Dragon's Lucha friends. It's Crazy Max, and it's Magnum Tokyo being Magnum Tokyo, but it's very digestible. There's not a ton going on. It's just a lot of young guys trying things, and it's not always what I want to watch, but when I'm in the mood for it, it really hits the spot.
Yeah, and it's something where I think that you kind of get to see, and as we start to talk about King of Dragon in that sort of fashion, you start to see the beats that would become familiar, and it almost in some ways, I kind of like, I love the network, what they have on the network and how it's presented, but getting like the grimy DVD thing where I'm seeing like the cuts into the studio kind of puts it a little bit more into perspective. That's not just like this pure on air, just what we see now today with just in-ring product. There was a lot of stuff based around it that happened that I feel like added a lot to those times.
Yeah, so what you're referring to is the format of Vamonos Amigos would obviously be the shows, the in-ring action, the promos, but then they would also have studio talk segments where it'd be, Ultimo Dragon and Magnum Tokyo, or it'd be Crazy Max, or it'd be whoever. They would provide commentary for those matches, but they would also kick them back to the studio and do studio segments. Those segments are absent on the Dragon Gate Network uploads.
Right.
Which is a bummer. So final note here, this is the November 2nd, 1998 Wrestling Observer newsletter, and I found this to be particularly interesting because Dave's relationship with Dragon Gate is odd. I never know how much he's watching, even when I email Dave recommendations, which I bounce in and out of whether or not I do that or not. But like, I was reading some old 2003 Observers last week for something else, and Dave is following Toryumon pretty closely. And, there are times where he's had the right people in his ear telling him that he should watch stuff, explaining the angles to him, and he gets it. I found it so interesting. In 1998, Dave says that he also got a chance to see some of the no component matches with Ultimo Dragon students. Dave says he saw a six-man, which included Dragon Kid and Magnum Tokyo. Tokyo is a great Mexican babyface doing the stripper gimmick a la Latin Lover. Although that gimmick would be a huge heel deal in the US, he's actually an amazing worker when he's allowed to show it, given his level of experience, which is just over a year. Dragon Kid is very reminiscent, in fact, in many ways better than Rey Mysterio Jr. at the same stage. He did one of the most mind-blowing moves I've ever seen. He gets on top and does the flip like he's going to do a 450, but lands on the guy's shoulders and then flips backwards to do a Hurricane Rana. He says, Dave said he does it totally professionally, no botching or sloppiness at all, which, we'll see if that lasts. And he said he also does a springboard Hurricane Rana from the same precision of Ray at his best. Then Dave ends this with, he also has only about 1 year in the business and has Phenom written all over him, and that both of these guys will debut on January 31st in Corkin Hall.
Yeah, so Dave got to see the Dragon Rana, which would become a 2-time Observer Awards Wrestling Move of the Year, and then the Super Hurricane Rana. But it is something where, so at this time, there were commercial Toryumon DVDs that would come out of this footage that I don't know if Dave got like the Nakapon tapes and that's where he got it, but like this footage didn't end up happening. It just ended up being commercial releases down the line.
And I don't know this for certain, but I think Ultimo might have had some distribution through Samurai TV at the time, because if you go through Observers in 97, there's a lot of controversy over the fact that Ultimo could work in Mexico without booking his dates through Sonny Ono, and that he also had a Japanese TV deal, which none of the other luchadors or anybody on the roster had anything of the sort, and WCW still allowed it.
Yeah, and of course, like that, those deals would later form the formation of Vámonos Amigos. So,
Yes.
like, the one thing that I think is remarkable when you like think about Ultimo as we kind of get to the end of this timeline is we've basically talked about his 90s here, and this is all up until essentially 1998. He's able to become a star in multiple promotions: Universal, New Japan, WAR, WCW, EMLL, CMLL, UWA, and he's able to put this all together in such a fashion that in a lot of ways, I feel like he could have just rested on his laurels, rested on the Hacienda, and some people might say that they hope he ends up doing that tomorrow, but it's something where I think you look at someone at least like at a certain period of time, like you talked about how like light was always shining on Ultimo's ass in a way, but he could not, other than like his elbow injury, he could not miss essentially for the entire decade of the 90s.
No, he was a brilliant wrestler, and I think a lot of his stuff from the 90s has actually aged extremely well. The only thing holding Ultimo back, if you're someone that kept track of his career post Nitro, is that from 2005 through 2018, he largely sucked. And that is such a bummer, because from 90 to 98, he is otherworldly. So it's just, it's a real shame that the injury happened and the botched surgery happened. I find it so interesting because I've always wondered this. Dave notes when Ultimo held his press conference announcing the show that he was hoping to be back wrestling on that first tour. And it's impossible to say, but I want to throw it in your head because you're a smart, creative guy. How do you think Toryumon changes if Ultimo was an active wrestler in his own promotion?
I think in some ways, I think that ends up being a not the worst case scenario, but I think that having Ultimo around means you don't have the attempts, and you don't have like, okay, well now we need to turn Crazy Max face, and we have M2K here, and now we have this 3-way kind of thing where we have kind of a trio of aces that kind of help. We have Ultimo around. There's no place for these aces because it's Ultimo's promotion. And from what we know of this man, would he make sure his students be featured well? Yes, but I think that you would have things being kind of restricted because the fact that he is there.
It's an odd thing. I mean,
Right.
it becomes, I think, a blessing in disguise that he's not an active wrestler, because you're either looking at, almost an older version of what he does now. Because, if you watch a modern Dragon Gate show, and this is why his presence doesn't bother me in the current day, because if you have a 7 match Dragon Gate show, 99% of the year, Ultimo is in a meaningless multi-man match that almost feels like it's off in its own universe. Only once or twice a year does Ultimo feel like he matters to the day-to-day of this promotion. I think we either get, Ultimo wrestling his luchador friends, which is the harmless version of him wrestling a Toryumon, or you have worst case scenario, maybe this promotion doesn't last because maybe he and Shima kill each other, or maybe he and Magnum kill each other, or maybe he steals Magnum's spotlight, or maybe he steals
Or
Shima's spotlight, and it's just a total disaster.
or you don't get the different fan base that is completely separate from the rest of Japanese pro wrestling because you have this middle-aged guy here instead of young hot guys.
Well, that's a great way to lead in to the show, because I said this, I reviewed this show on Between the Sheets with Zellner and David Bixenspan a few years ago, and I really wanted to get across the fact, and I talked about this a little bit when I did the Patreon audio with Joe and Rich over the Observer Hall of Fame this year when I talked about Shima. It's really important to note that from January 31st, 1999 through now, Toryumon, Dragon Gate, 2 words, 1 word, Dragon Gate, whatever you want to look at it as, has been a box office success. And this first show is a legitimate sellout. They claimed 2,100. There might have been 2,500 people in Corkin Hall. It is one of the most crowded times this venue has ever looked. And one of the defining characteristics of this promotion early on, I would say from probably 99 through 2003, is the fan base itself is very different than your traditional Japanese wrestling fan base, Mike.
Yeah, it's I would say conservatively 85% women and 15% men, and it is something that is at the forefront, and it's something where it Dragon Gate, early Toryumon Japan sounds different than basically every other promotion in history. Like with the exception of probably early 80s All Japan Women, I
Yeah.
would say. But because it's just that kind of heavily slated, like, and as how wrestling kind of changes through times, it has now gone to a point where I would say it's probably 65-35 women at that point. But when you have it in a show like this, and you have it especially positioned very clearly, as we start talking about King of Dragon, the debut of Raising the Army of Toryumon Japan, it's based around one person, and all the women there are to see this one guy.
Magnum fucking Tokyo.